Welcome to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Our mission is to bring you discussions on a wide array of topics in the coaching world to grow players on and off the court. You can connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and also reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Now, here's your host, Coach Mike Hernandez.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us wherever you are listening from and on whatever platform you are listening on. This episode is going to take us in a really interesting direction. We're going to talk about how the high school game, yes, we're talking about basketball, but we're also going to probably broaden it to a little bit more beyond basketball. We're going to talk about how the game is looked at through the lens of a journalist who has covered prep sports, including basketball, among many other sports. We as coaches, we see things from our vantage point, and we're focused on our program, we're focused on our athletes, and that's the lens that we view the game from. But we're going to talk today about how the game looks like from a different vantage point, in this case, somebody who is a sports writer, who is a journalist, and kind of what he sees in the coaching world and what he sees in his interactions with players, and basically how we can utilize and make the best out of that relationship between us as coaches versus those journalists and those sports writers who take the time to actually speak to us and cover our games. So it is a pleasure to have with me journalist and freelance sports writer, Mr. Daniel Spevak. Daniel, how are you today?
I'm hanging in there. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great. I think that it's one of those topics that we don't really discuss a lot, where we're used to having, people in the media or journalists around, but I think it's important to make sure that we open up that discussion to kind of get an insight into what you see and what goes in the process of what you do. So let's go ahead and get that started. Let's go ahead with your introduction to you, your journey, and kind of where this journey of being a sports writer has taken you.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. When I was in high school, I didn't really want to go to school for sports writing. That's not to say I was never really big on sports or journalism or anything along those lines. But I first started out wanting to be a meteorologist, And it turns out I'm not that good at math. I'm not that good at science. So that was not ever part of the plan. And I was always kind of looking for something to fall back on. And I've always just been very into sports, especially analytical side of sports. Growing up, I would, look at every stat, watch every game, everything that was available to me. And I just really got into it, switched my major, and I went to Penn State University in State College, Pennsylvania. I was writing for the Daily Collegian, which was the newspaper there. And I covered their wrestling team, which has always been, one of the best in the country. And I covered tennis while I was there, did a little bit of stuff here and there with some other sports like their men's baseball team, and really just kind of got into the flow of things. And I kind of, parlayed that into an internship with what was at the time Comcast Sports in Philadelphia. It's now NBC Sports Philadelphia. I did that my senior summer right before I graduated from college in 2015. And then right after college, a buddy of mine who was working at a paper in New Jersey, he, offered me an opportunity to say, hey, are you looking for any positions, anything like that? I was right out of college. I said, yeah, sure. Put in a good word with their sports editor over there, and basically been freelancing for them ever since. Started out covering field hockey consistently just for the next few years. I covered soccer, track and field, girls basketball. I did some high school football for their sister paper, the Daily Journal, down in Vineland, New Jersey, which is a little bit further south. And, I still occasionally do some freelance. I did some soccer stuff this past, fall before the, COVID and the pandemic really took over and shut everything down. As far as what I've been doing since then, I do have a full-time job that I go to. I've been working there for about 3 years now. So I still have that going for me, thankfully. I try to blog a little bit here and there on the side just to kind of keep myself fresh, keep myself in it when it comes to writing, but not stuff that I really publish. It's a lot of stuff I just kind of keep to myself, and, just more so to keep my writing game kind of, going a little bit so I don't, sit on the sidelines for too long. So that's kind of my journey, how I got to at least this part of my life and freelancing and everything else.
So it's safe to say you're keeping yourself busy. Even with all of this COVID stuff as we're talking right now, there are things that you're doing to keep yourself occupied.
Yeah, I mean, across the country, there's obviously a lot of people that don't currently have jobs, but I myself am thankful to still have a full-time job. I still have to go to the office, and we still have to take all those precautions that we have to,
Hmm.
but thankfully still working, still, have income coming in. So that's at least one good side of this, even though, from a journalism perspective, things have dried up a little bit. But, once things kind of go away, start getting back into it a little bit more, hopefully. So.
Right. I mean, there's always, even if there isn't games to cover, like you said, it's important that you're keeping your writing, up to date and practicing and just making sure you're ready to go. Because at some point, fingers crossed, we're going to be starting again and things are going to be happening again. So yeah, fingers crossed on that, and hopefully you'll have some stuff to cover soon. So before we kind of dive in more in like a basketball type lens, because you've covered so much, so like I said, we're probably going to go in more directions than just basketball necessarily, but I wanted to talk about in general your interactions, your coverage, any interviews or anything that you've done with just high school coaches in general. I know that some coaches are very wary of talking to the media, and there's almost like this adversarial, like confrontational relationship that they have when people start asking questions or interviewing. How do you, as somebody who covers sports, try to avoid those sort of like tense interviews, and why, for the most part, should coaches usually feel comfortable talking to reporters, especially if it's covering like a high school sport?
Yeah, I mean, the way I always approach an interview, and obviously it's a little bit different than if you're covering a game versus going out and doing, let's say, a feature story or something like
Mhm.
that. But the way I always try to approach an interview with a coach or even players for that instance is I try to give them free reign to kind of discuss what they feel comfortable discussing. I'll go into it more of in a conversational type of way. I won't walk in and be like, all right, so let's lay this out. Next question, let's lay this out. It's kind of like, all right, let's start out. If it's a game, I'll start out and just be like, so, give me your overall thoughts of the game. And then kind of going off of that, I can kind of read what their emotions are, what their feelings are, and kind of bridge the gap from there to continue the interview. But I definitely like to give them free reign. With high school sports, there's always kind of a fine line you have to tread with certain things. The kind of questions you would ask, say, a college or professional coach don't always translate to what you want to talk about with a high school coach. For instance, you can ask questions about game plans. You can ask questions about how they decided to coach a certain thing or how they scouted an opponent or something like that. Those are things that are very similar. But you try not to, at least from high school perspective, you don't want to stray in too much of a critical side of things. You have to remember at the end of the day, these are coaches that are coaching kids, especially high school, 14 through 18-year-olds. These are kids that are, playing sports sometimes just for the fun of it. They're not necessarily playing for a scholarship or for the idea of going pro someday. So you kind of have to be careful with what you say and what you do, because if it comes off as you're being too critical of them or you're being too critical of a teenager, that can really kind of rub them the wrong way. And I think that's where some of those adversarial relationships that you had mentioned come into it. So I try not to go too, when you're asking something that may come off as critical, I try to frame it in a way that's, oh, this player may have not played as well as you wanted them to, but was there a way that you tried to get them into the game a little bit more? Try to
Mhm.
focus those more critical questions into ways that are, kind of, I can't even think of the word I want to say, but ways that are more kind of describing how they would put it into their perspective. Give them the chance to kind of be the one that says, you know what, yeah, it was like this, but we did this to fix that issue. So it's kind of things you have to kind of deal with in the high school aspect of things. And that's not to say that coaches are not necessarily above criticism when it comes to certain things, but you don't want to approach, say a bad game or a bad effort from a player or even from a coach, the same way if you were covering, say, the NFL or the NBA. You got to kind of tread lightly there. And coaches should definitely be comfortable talking to us because we're really there to tell, general human interest to a point. A lot of things I've learned, especially in the changing world of journalism, is people don't necessarily want just box scores anymore. People want to know what happened in that game, but just picking up the thing and saying, all right, this person went in, scored 30 points, 10 assists, led his team or her team to victory. People don't want to just read that. They want the general human interest of things. They want to know, why does this coach and this player have a connection? Why does this coach's history of, winning championships really, help him with this new upstart team that he's trying to do the same for? Those are the kind of things. So I think coaches really should be comfortable talking to us, and we want to make them comfortable talking to us, just because we really want to get, the stories out there that need to be told and are good for people to hear, as opposed to just, all right, here's what, John Doe did last night, or here's what, Jane Doe did to win the game, or something like that. So I think kind of bridging those gaps and having those conversations with coaches and with players to an extent really helps, make those relationships better.
Well, I really like that you mentioned the story aspect, but also about the way that a reporter might approach a high school coach versus one who's at the collegiate level or at the professional level. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into that question specifically.
Sure.
When a high school coach is being approached by somebody, and I know it's different whether it's like a feature or depending on what the story is, but when a high school coach is being approached by somebody in the media, how is that interaction typically different than if that same reporter was going to talk to a collegiate coach or a professional coach? Because I think I want to try and make clear that the relationship that high school coaches are probably going to have with their media is probably going to be a lot different than a collegiate or a professional coach would.
Yeah, I guess I look at it in the sense of, with a collegiate or professional coach, you have sports information directors in college, and then you got PR people in professional. So right off the bat, it's more of and I don't say this in necessarily negative light, because what journalists do, especially on those professional and collegiate levels, is incredible. And there's a lot of amazing writers out there who can get above and beyond different things, but it's a very sterilized environment sometimes. Whereas in high school, you're walking up to the coach on the sideline after the end of the game and grabbing them before they walk off to the locker room, and you never see them the rest of the night, And whereas in professional or in college, you get time set aside for a press conference or whatever. And if it's too controversial a question, or a coach doesn't want, he could just get up and kind of walk away, and that's not to say high school coaches can't do that as well. But, it's like, it's kind of, you approach them more in I guess it's less of trying to think of the word, not a sterilized kind of way, like I was saying before, but you don't approach them in the way that they're like this untouchable figure. There's a lot of coaches that you kind of talk to, if you're a beat writer for a team, let's say in the NFL, you may talk to those coaches and form a relationship with them. But realistically, at the end of the day, it's like, it's more of a professional kind of like, you're sitting down having, a meeting. Whereas with me, if I grab a girls basketball coach that it's known me numerous times, like there was one girls basketball coach that I had talked to, a couple of times. There's a tournament that's run every year in South Jersey girls basketball, where some of the coaches help out, and I've run into them, and, you have casual conversations with them, and they're people, you kind of do it in a way of like where you become a little bit more friendly with them. You kind of start to learn their mannerisms more so, and you kind of, pick up on things that, you will pick up on, a little bit more, because you're more in it with them, I guess is a good way to say, there's times where, kind of going off of what we were talking about with that relationship that they have with the media, there's times where, for instance, like a couple of years ago, there were a couple players who transferred in South Jersey under kind of controversial type of things. There was some issues of, I don't want to get too into it, but people claiming that there was issues with coaches and things that were going on at practices, and people didn't want to be a part of that, so they transferred. You don't want to just jump into it and be like, so why did that player transfer? You kind of go up to them, and they're not necessarily comfortable talking about that, or at times told not to speak on that until, say, the school themselves has made a statement or something like that, depending on the severity of it or whatever it may be. But sometimes you can kind of have those more conversational things with them, and I don't think necessarily you get that with coaches at those higher levels, especially if you kind of start swaying into, something that may be a little bit more controversial. They may be like, well, we haven't released a statement on that or something like that. Whereas, it's different. There is definitely a fine line, and it's not completely different in that aspect, but there's certainly those certain things you need to kind of, just approach differently, I guess is kind of the way I want to put it.
Well, it sounds like, and you can clarify if I have a misconception, but it sounds like somebody who's covering high school sports is at least a little bit more willing to kind of work with the person that they're interviewing, and like you said, kind of create that relationship a little bit more, and be a little bit more flexible. Whereas I get the sense, at least from an outsider, that a collegiate reporter or a professional reporter, like, they have a bit of information they need to get. They have that question that they have to ask, and it's
Right.
very, like,
Yeah.
to the point. If I'm getting that correct.
Yeah, you are. And definitely, and something else to remember is, when it comes to high school coaches, some of them are doing it, they love it. They love coaching. They love, and that's why they're doing it. Whereas for some of these professional and collegiate coaches, at the end of the day, it's a job. They are held to a higher standard than, say, high school coaches are. Now, again, like I was saying, it's not to say that high school coaches just get to do whatever they want. But, there's a lot of times where their kids are playing for that team, or they have people on there who, I said before, aren't trying to get scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to be part of a team. They have their friends. They just want to be a part of that atmosphere. Whereas on the professional or the collegiate game, in the NFL or the NBA or something, these are guys making millions of dollars, where there's like a standard that they have to uphold.
Yep.
And there's, certain things that they have to specifically touch on. Whereas in high school, it's a little bit more laid back. It's a little bit more, you still want to obviously coach them and do whatever, but you still want them to have fun, because at the end of the day, like I said, they're teenagers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like too that you're kind of covering also a little bit more on, like, the human interest side, and also on the personal side, because, like, kids, athletes, in particular, they probably like seeing their name in an article, or they like, and the community probably likes that, and the families like it. So there's definitely more of, like, that human interest and personal interest side, I think, where
Mm-hmm.
like not that you always are doing this, but you have it's good for everybody, I guess, if, like, things can be, like, talked about in a positive light and in more of, like, an encouraging light, especially if it's, like you said, talking about, like, high school athletes in particular.
Yeah, exactly. You're
Yep.
100% correct. And there's a lot of times where, even if you just briefly mention a kid's name in a paper, even if it was just, hey, he had an assist here on this one play that happened
Mhm.
to have some significance or something like that. And I think that's important, and a lot of times they really do like seeing that, and sometimes they'll even mention that to you, be like, "Hey, thanks for talking about me in that story," or sometimes their family will walk up to you, be like, "Hey, thanks for mentioning my son or daughter," in this and that instance. It's there's more to it than just, here's some guys making millions of dollars and trying to win a Super Bowl or trying to win an NBA championship.
Mhm.
There's a big difference there, and I don't necessarily know. I think people get it to an extent. But when you're not really in the know, kind of, I think there is kind of that lacking of information as to why don't you handle this the same way as you'd handle that. I don't necessarily think, from that outsider's perspective, people always understand that.
Right. Yeah, I think there's sometimes this perception of, like, no matter whether you're a high school coach or whatever level, you just hear the word media, and then it's like, and then people get
Right,
worried,
exactly.
and then they don't know what's going on. But yeah, like that. And I think that's really important that you mentioned too. Like, obviously, my obligation as a high school coach, uh, my job description and my duties are certainly different than somebody at the collegiate level or the professional level. And
Hmm.
luckily, as you alluded to, I think a lot of people who cover high school sports, they understand that, and they understand that at the end of the day, me coaching is not my full-time job. I have other things that I do that pay my bills, and other things I'm responsible for. So the pressure, as you kind of spoke about, isn't the same as somebody who's doing this full time, getting paid a lot of money to do so.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So let's we're going to talk about basketball, and again, we can talk about other sports that you've kind of noticed trends in as well, but we'll definitely make sure we touch on the basketball part now. When
Hmm.
you have moved into the journalist side, so you're in the stands, you're in the field, you're kind of seeing things from that viewpoint, how is covering the game of basketball, how has it kind of changed the way that you look at the sport? Are there trends that you've noticed, whether it's in gameplay, behavior, or atmosphere, that you've kind of picked up on as you've covered as many games as you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because admittedly, growing up, I was not this huge basketball fan.
Hmm.
I was a sports fan and I would keep tabs on things, but I was never really, it was not the sport that I paid a ton of attention to. It was mostly football, baseball, and hockey for me, or
Yeah.
really the three that I've always loved growing up. And, I was born in 92, so I caught the tail end of the Bulls dynasty once I was finally old enough to realize kind of what was happening. And then, of course, Space Jam comes out in 96, and that played a big role about how I felt about basketball. But, of course, I feel like a lot of millennials are kind of that same way. It's got that cult-like status to it. I think my real first dive into being a huge basketball fan was when Allen Iverson carried the Sixers to the finals in 2001. Living in Philadelphia,
right.
It was really hard not to fall in love with that team and that run, and the whole city was just behind them. I just remember standing on our street corner as kids with signs saying "Honk if you love the Sixers" or "If you want the Sixers to win," and people would go crazy, and there was flags on everybody's cars.
Yeah.
So, I say that because, like I said, I wasn't this big basketball person, and as time has gone on, I've gotten more into the sport. And I think covering basketball is a big reason why I've really kind of become more of a fan of the game. I'm not the biggest fan of basketball that there ever has been. I'm not going to pretend to be. I know there's people out there that can rattle off stats like there's nothing, but it's definitely helped me see the game differently. And when I say that, it's helped me better analyze kind of what I'm watching and seeing the game from different perspectives. When you're covering a game versus watching a game as a fan, you have to find stories. You have to look at everything going on in the court. You can't just follow the ball, say, all right, it went in, this person got an assist, this person scored, this person got a rebound. You can't just look at it from that perspective. You have to see it from every angle, and you kind of gain a new appreciation for things. And that has definitely helped me learn more of the ins and outs of basketball and learn more about how the game is played. And I think, basketball is a very team-oriented sport. That's not to say that the guy or girl that can go out there and score 30 points and grab 10 rebounds isn't going to go out there and dominate the headlines and win most games for teams. It's not to say that. But, somebody has to get that person the ball. Somebody has to play defense on the other end to keep the other team from scoring. There's different roles and different things that play, even for the guys and girls that sit on the bench most of the time and maybe get in for a couple minutes at a time. And I think focusing on that and seeing how important those role players are is something else that I really gained from covering the sport in that, in that instance is, kind of those human interests, like I was saying before. A lot of times, we're going to write 5, 6, 7, 8 stories a month on maybe the girl who scored, most of their points. But what about that person that sits at the end of the bench that had to, fill in for somebody on an injury? Or how about the freshman that's been starting all year that finally had a big game, in a championship or playoff type atmosphere? Those are the kind of things that you kind of, you focus on more when you cover it from that. And, and you kind of get to see how things really come together more when you're sitting on the sidelines or you're sitting in the stands as an analytical kind of, coverage type of thing as a media perspective, as opposed to as a fan, you're like, whoa, that it was a foul, or, oh, there goes that person scoring all those points. And wow, look at this person play. You get a better recognition for what you're watching, I think.
Well, that's really fascinating because the similarity is so striking between kind of your perception and then also a coach's perception, because as a coach, I'm certainly not just looking at the ball. Like I'm paying attention to all these other things. And as you're not just looking at, the ball and what's happening there. You're seeing a lot of other things as well. And so you mentioned about stories. So I'm curious as to your thought process. So as a game is going on and you're not just paying attention to the ball, as coaches aren't either, are there other particular areas that like you're specifically making sure that you pay attention to? Are there things that you just look at as they catch your interest? Like, is there a process that goes through the story lens that you look things through?
That's a really good question. I think it definitely varies depending on the circumstance in which the game is being played. If I'm at, let's say, the two teams or crosstown rivals who are playing for the championship, I'm going to look at that differently than, say, a game in the beginning of the season. But when it comes to kind of watching a game for stories, you don't necessarily always go into a game. And I think this is kind of the beauty of covering sports as a journalist, not just basketball, but any sport. You don't always go into a game with a specific story in mind. There may be one that sticks out and there may be one you want to cover, but then you also think, all right, well, there's those other two journalists from papers in the area or the other, team's area's paper sitting there ready to write that same story. So you can kind of go into it thinking, all right, what's going to happen in, say, the first 5 minutes of the game that I can kind of own in on and use that. And then you start to notice trends, and you start to notice, let's say person misses a basket down one end and misses another basket, misses that, and you kind of start focusing on them. All right, are they going to break out of this funk? You kind of set things off to the side, and you're like, all right, I know they've missed a few shots, but I'll come back to them later to see how, maybe if they make a big shot down the line that puts their team up or ties it or, lessens the gap or something like that. You kind of just pick up on little things here and there. And you try to focus that on an overarching story. And then it's funny, there's been times where I'll be sitting there and, as a high school sports reporter, we have to, a lot of times keep our own stats and do things like that. But there's been a lot of times where I'll be sitting there and be like, all right, here's the story I'm writing, here's this and that. And then you'll go to talk to a coach and they'll be like, yeah, I can't believe the way that this one player put in an effort, or I can't believe that one call at that point, things just changed from there. And then you're like, wow, you didn't really see that as being necessarily as big of a moment as it was. But when the coach kind of puts that into your mind, you think, wow, that's something I can really focus on. I can say, you know what, here's where I'm going to write that story from. And it kind of going back to what we were discussing before, in collegiate and professional levels, you're going to get that replay 6-7 times on TV or on the Jumbotron, whereas you're not going to get that in a high school game. Somebody knocks a ball out of bounds and the coach or the referee calls it the wrong way. You're not going to get, all right, we're going to go to a scorer's table, do a review of this and everything. It's basically a judgment call. Those are calls that can go either way. And you don't think about them necessarily always in the context of when they're happening, depending on what the context of the overall game is. But then you go back and you kind of, say, wow, that was important. This was really important. This other, this block or this rebound here at this point, and you try to focus on those little things and kind of piece things together. And like I said, there have been times where the game has ended and I'm like, I kind of know what I want to say, but you want that quote from the coach where you could kind of frame the story around that or something along those lines. So I think that definitely plays a big factor in that.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that with the conversation that you have with coaches and how something that a coach says could be something that kind of shifts the way that story is told or the perception that you as a reporter might have and almost rewrite your story in a sense. And so that's fascinating to me, because then that kind of makes me think as a coach that when we have those conversations with those reporters, like we as coaches do have a lot of input and we can actually offer a lot of insight and almost, it seems like, give you a different perspective to take your story maybe sometimes in a different direction than you anticipated.
Yeah, and there's been even times where I used to do like end of the year awards, like player of the year, coach of the year, make an all-star team kind of. And I'll email a coach and I'll be like, hey, coach, I really want to talk to you about this player for this and that. I think she really was this and that. And then they'll go and say, I really appreciate that and everything, but maybe focus on this player. Not to say that they are picking it for us, because, we still go in that direction. Okay, this was the team or this was, but sometimes they'll be like, look at the effort that this person put in. And it kind of, there's kind of that working relationship to say, not to say that the coach is going to tell us, you should write this story. Don't write that story. Write this story. Yeah. But there's a lot of kind of that working relationship where they'll be like, I want you to give this person their credit, and I think they deserve credit, but really the backbone of our team was this person, or, this game was really the game that you guys should be focusing on as opposed to this. And it's kind of good to kind of pull in that perspective sometimes. You don't necessarily change your stories completely, but it helps you kind of get a better idea of what is that coach thinking, what is that perspective, and how can I utilize that to build on the story I'm writing and put that into a perspective that people can read when they pick up the newspaper or go online or something like that.
So then it sounds like from your experience in what you've done, that a coach who can build a positive relationship with those journalists and with those sports writers, if a coach can kind of build that relationship and almost build trust in both ways, then a coach has a lot more chance of getting their voice heard than if they like advocate for a player or they like advocate for something. Again, you might not change your story or anything like that, but it's a lot more likely that if a coach speaks up about somebody, that it's more likely that you as a reporter in your case might be more receptive to hearing it if that relationship has already been built.
Yeah, and it gives us a chance to focus on, before, like I was saying, it gives us a chance to focus on those players that may not get their name in print as much as other players do, and it gives us a chance to cover different aspects of things. And I think that working relationship really helps provide those avenues for us to get stories like that done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great, and hopefully for any coaches listening, hopefully if they're able to build those relationships, knowing that it's different across the country and different probably across different cities within different states, but just building that positive relationship and being more comfortable around people in the media and being receptive probably will hopefully lead to your voice as a coach being heard more, and hopefully reporters being a lot more comfortable talking to you as a coach, and then the coach can be more comfortable talking to the reporter, and then everybody wins, because then ultimately, as you could probably speak to, it's really a lot of times about the players and their stories and the things that put them in a good light.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm curious about, and I've heard a couple of coaches talk about it, not quite being sure in terms of the media and what you guys do, is high school players in particular are always looking to try and stand out. They're looking to boost their profile, especially if they have aspirations that go beyond just playing in high school. And one of the things I'm pretty confident in saying that can help boost their profile is the interactions and the way that they kind of use media and social media also to get their name out there. So if you're talking to players who maybe aren't the most like media savvy, or they're not really that comfortable and they're not really used to kind of advocating and speaking about themselves and speaking for themselves, is there a way that you personally try to get those players a little bit more comfortable? And are there things that you think maybe players can do to try and relax and feel a bit more comfortable if they're talking to a reporter?
It can be tough,
Mm-hmm.
because there are times where you'll get a player who's not comfortable talking to you, or just gives you one or two word answers, and there's not a lot of times you can really build something off of that. I think the biggest thing a lot of times is letting the personality of those players really shine. I know I said that kind of in a way with the coaches earlier, but when it comes to the players, a lot of them will step up to you and be like, they'll ramble on for an hour if you let them to. And, a lot of them like the spotlight, but some of them that don't, you try to figure out like what maybe is making them nervous, or what can I kind of focus on, or something like that, and if they give you even an inch, and when I say give you an inch, I don't necessarily mean like, take advantage of something, but if they give you an inch and like, they said something that you're kind of like, that seems out there, or that seems like something I can kind of follow up with a question on. You try to kind of own in on that and build off of that. And then it starts to, you gradually start to see some of these athletes become more comfortable. And I think a lot of times some too is, let's say I'm talking to somebody after a game, if you know that he had a big game a couple weeks ago or something and has kind of struggled for a while, and then, he has a decent game, you talk to him and, mention something that will kind of make him feel more comfortable, or make her feel more comfortable to talk, and say, oh, well, yeah, I'm glad you recognize that. And, it's just been this and that. And they start to open up a little bit. You don't always get that. And there are some kids that are forever going to be, very kind of shy and timid and don't necessarily want to open up to us. But, there are times where you may be able to break that shell a little bit more. And I think just kind of finding those moments in the individual interviews allows you to do that. Something else I noticed too is times we'll grab a player who is more shy and timid and have them talk next to somebody who's a little bit more willing, maybe not the most outspoken person on the team, but somebody who's a little bit more willing. And a lot of times they feel more comfortable because they're next to their teammate or their friend, or they kind of see that they're talking and they're like, you know what, I can open up a little bit more. I can share a little bit more of my thoughts, or, oh, they said something that I didn't even think about. Let me kind of elaborate on that. So, you try to find little nuances and things and pull those in and work off of them. It can be tough at times. And, sometimes I found full teams that are just going to give you the very cliche, we got to do better kind of answers. And then there's times where,
where players will just go on and, you get some of the best quotes you're going to write down. And I think, there's kind of a fine line you have to tiptoe sometimes, and you don't want to overstep sometimes and try to get more out of a player who's not willing to and doesn't feel comfortable, because then, they may always treat you like that the next couple times you talk to them,
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I like that, like what you said about taking something and just being able to expound upon it and add to it. And like you said, you're not like taking advantage, but if somebody gives you something that's relatively shy or not comfortable, like you can work with that and kind of work with their answer and kind of build that camaraderie and get them a little bit more comfortable, because like you said, not everybody is going to be super comfortable, but if they can just give you something, it sounds like if they can give you something that you can work with, like you'll be able to make that work and add to it and put them at ease, it seems.
Yeah, and another way to kind of build off of that too is you always try to keep things loose. You don't want to make it feel like they have this like super obligation to write your story for you, where you're waiting for that one quote or you try to talk them into that quote. I always try to keep it loose. And if somebody feels like they're nervous, maybe ask them a couple easy questions just to help them open up a little bit and get them talking a little bit more. And then, you just kind of go with the flow sometimes. And like I was saying before, you can tell who wants to talk and who doesn't want to talk. You don't want to force it though, because like I said, that can kind of create those more adversarial relationships where they don't feel comfortable talking to you. Yeah. So I think just keeping it loose is really a good way to, kind of go with the flow and feel it out as time goes along.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And so I think one of the things, and that this kind of put the light bulb in my head of another question I had, I think one of the things that coaches tend to worry about or be a little apprehensive about if their players are talking is that when a player speaks, what they say represents the school. And so it represents the school in the media's light. And so if somebody says something, it's not just, oh, this player said it, it was this player from this school that said it.
Right.
Is there, I guess there's no like a secret formula or anything like that, but is there a way that players can make sure if they're talking to the media that they're like representing themselves in their school in the best light? I know that they might not be thinking about that when they answer, but I know as coaches that's something that we worry about. But are there certain like answers or certain things that players say that you're like, wow, like this makes like not only you look good, but this makes the school look good? We'll keep it on the positive end because I'm sure there's a lot of examples of the negative end, but just speaking on the positive end.
Well, it's interesting you say there's probably a lot of negative sides, because I'll be honest with you, in the few years I've been doing this, I haven't really hit a lot of those negative things.
That's
not
awesome.
to say that like, not to say that there's not those like, they would call that foul, or, sometimes they want to talk about the referees and such, obviously that happens. There's emotions in sports, and kids obviously want to be a part of that too. But you don't see a lot of that. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of what I recognize when I talk to these kids is there's always a respect for the opposing team. Even in these big rivalry games or these crosstown things or, stuff like that, there's always, that team played well, we got to give them a hand, this stuff. And I think a lot of that comes from working with the coaches who really try to instill that, respect in them. And I think a lot of it comes from, when you're in a team sport, you're around so many people and that so many different efforts go into it and things, there's not that trash talking like there is, in higher levels of sports where it's like, all right, I'm going to outrun you and earn this contract as opposed to you. It's like, nobody's earning a contract in high school. Nobody's, at least not yet, but nobody's earning money. Nobody's doing this and that. It's all about, kind of that love of the sport and that love of the game. And I know that sounds so cliche in a way, especially as a coach, you probably try to, there's people are always probably saying, kids that play for the love of the game and stuff. But there are some out there that play because they're really competitive and they want to prove that they're better than others. But I've never really come across that in interviews and such where, at least they don't portray it in that way. They portray it in the, I work my butt off. I work out all week. I do this and that. And I'm always, spending extra time with my coach and my teammates. And always, like there's a lot of times where I have to do player of the year stories like I mentioned before. And I'll talk to a player and I'll be like, what efforts did you put in? What did you do specifically in this and that? And they're always turn around and say, well, it was just the effort of like me and my teammates helping me and picking me up and doing a lot of things for me and working with me and keeping it loose and keeping the camaraderie. And it's just something I always recognize in a lot of these interviews. And it's funny because times when you want kids to talk about themselves, they almost refuse to. They almost refuse to take credit for their own accomplishments sometimes, not to say that they should in a selfish manner, but a lot of times they're so willing to talk about the coaching and the players and the community and the parents and everybody around them that really helps them get there. It's not about themselves. And I recognize that almost every time I talk to a player.
Well, that's awesome. That's great. And I'm definitely glad that exists. And I'm glad, like you said, that there's so many positive stories and very few that go the other way. And so I'm hoping that can ease the mind of maybe some coaches who haven't interacted a lot with the media to just think that, if you give kids a chance, a lot of times they're going to say what they really mean. And honestly, a lot of times what they really mean is going to be positive. And like you said, give credit to their teammates, or if they're going to talk about themselves, it could be just like the work that they put in and how hard they tried and things like that. So hopefully that can put some coaches' minds at ease to kind of think that, okay, my players will be just fine if they're left to talk, and then they'll say good things and they'll say the right things. And it's also funny that you mentioned a little bit about how some of the things that you said you thought were cliche, but honestly, I think a lot of the players, and you can probably speak to this too, of any sport, that a lot of players, the things that they'll speak about and the things that they'll talk about are also reflected by the coaches and the program itself. And so if the coaches are building a certain environment and building a certain philosophy about the way that their team conducts themselves, probably 99 times out of 99, a player will kind of reiterate and exhibit those same values when talking to you.
Yeah. And I think that's, another big difference from high school sports to the other levels is, a lot of times, yes, a coach does want their program or their team or their franchise to come off as respectable and everything. But, there's just so many ins and outs when it comes to those higher levels, whereas lower level, at the end of the day, it's about those relationships they're forming with each other. It's about, just getting out there, being active in some cases for some people and just playing. And I think that, you really see that a lot among high school level of sports.
Right. Yep. Absolutely agreed. And so it's funny. We've talked about quite a bit about the distinction between high school athletics and the way that athletes and coaches are treated versus the way that they may be treated in the collegiate or professional level. But at the same time, it seems to me, or maybe it's always been this way, but it seems to me now, like more than ever, that there's so much importance being put on high school athletes and high school athletics and the outcomes of games and things like that. And
right.
How do you hope other journalists kind of balance the idea of, okay, this is very important to some people in our community and they get really like into this, versus, but at the same time, some of these kids I'm talking to are like 15 years old, and so it can't be that big of a deal. Like how is that balance for you in balancing kind of both of those objectives?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly tough to a point because what your editor and what the community want isn't necessarily always what the coach or the team or the player wants to see. And there is certainly a difference there. I think the biggest thing is, make the big moments feel big. If a kid hits a game-winning shot or team wins their first title in however long, make those moments feel big. But don't make those small moments not feel as important, I guess is a good way to put it. Like somebody hits a small milestone in a game, or, this player sat on the bench all year and comes off and scores 15 points for, their first real playing time. Make those small moments feel big, because like you're saying, at the end of the day, you have to remember these are kids. They're not adults. They're not going to pick it up and have necessarily the same, I don't even know how to really put what I'm trying to say. Like, if a person picks up a newspaper recently, be like, oh, well, I don't like this player, and they're making him seem like his struggles are, he's making too much money or this and that. Like an adult will look at it like that. But as a kid, if you're picking up a story, picking up a newspaper and reading a story, say like your team played last night or your opponent for next week played their game, you're not looking at that as, well, why are you talking about it like this? You're looking at it like, okay, that's, it's you're looking at it more from that like educational perspective in a way. And that's not to speak on the behalf of all of them, but I think, some of them look at it that way. And there is always that cool aspect, like you were talking earlier about, wow, my name's in the newspaper, but also kind of that, like, it's important to see these stories and see, how big what they're doing can be, even if it seem as important on the grand scheme of things. And, there's a lot of times where sports, goes beyond sports. I can think of an instance where there was a player for a team who had brain cancer, and she ended up passing away. She didn't play for a couple years, and then she ended up passing away. And they played a crosstown rival like their next game, and there was a whole ceremony before the game where they did a moment of silence, and the other team gave them flowers, and they were raising money at the game, and they all wore specific colors to remember her by and stuff like that. It's like, remembering that sometimes, it doesn't even have to be something that that big. It doesn't have to be a kid dying of brain cancer or a story that big to say, that every part of it is important, and you don't want to make it seem like, well, you got to remember how important this is because you want them to still have fun. So I think, but remembering that it's about more than just going out there winning a game. It's about more than wins and losses when it comes to this kind of stuff. And, as far as other reporters and what you want them to keep in mind is, you want them to kind of just remember that getting those stories out there are important, and I know I've kind of said that already, and I'm trying to think of a way to say it differently, but getting those kind of human nature things out there and just remembering that they are who they are at the end of the day. That's kind of what we should focus on. Don't focus on necessarily the game. The game isn't that important. There are games that are very important, and that's what you're covering, but they're not always really important. Focus on the players' personalities. Focus on how, there's a player on the team who keeps it kind of loose and playful and keeps it from getting too tense in big spots. Or, maybe that coach that has like a real fiery passion in the game for winning, not necessarily to a point where they're overly fiery, but to a point where they really, are getting the best out of their players. The results don't ultimately matter all the time. They do for standings, they do for seedings, they do for, people picking up the papers just to see who won, with their alma maters or whatever, but truly showing who the kids are, what they have to offer, and what they are even off the court, I think is a valuable experience I've really gained from covering sports at this level. And I think it's something that a lot of people should focus on. You want those kids to be able to tell their stories in their own ways too. You don't want it to just be focused on the results or the outcome of the game.
Well, it makes perfect sense for a couple reasons, and then your answer made me think of something as well. First off, is that like you said about players who are like going to see their name in the paper and whatnot. I know a lot of people who cover prep sports and high school sports. They have different social media accounts, and I know for a fact that there are players who follow those accounts. And I think that if players see a lot of like more negative stories, which they don't, I'm going to just say that they're most of them are very positive, but if they were to see like a lot of like negative stories or things that are very like confrontational, that's probably going to make some players nervous, like, oh, what's going to happen if they ever come talk to me or come talk about my school. And so just kind of understanding that players, are definitely paying attention to the way that these stories are covered. And then another thing that you mentioned at the end of your answer, which I thought was so true, because I've been thinking about through this conversation, the different high school sports reporters in my area in Arizona who I really like. And one of the things that I found that a lot of them have in common, and you can speak to this about your area, is that the ones here that I really like love Arizona. They love the communities. They love the area. And so they're very vested in kind of celebrating like the good things that are happening and celebrating like the important stories, whether it's, people coming together or people being really successful. And I think that the ones that I've seen here that are the best at covering high school sports don't just necessarily love the sport that they're covering, but they truly love like the community, the area, and then just the school environment itself. And so I think that that's also something that I've noticed, and it sounds like, and I'll let you speak on it, but it sounds like that's something that you experience and you've seen as well.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see it, and the cool thing about South Jersey is, there's guys that have been doing it for years, who know the ins and outs of the communities, who know, and people know them. They don't even need to like read their byline, and they automatically know, yeah, this person wrote that story, and they're legends. I hate to use that word because it's very it's putting people on a pedestal that you don't want them necessarily
I get it,
on.
though.
And they probably would, and they would probably say, I'm not a legend, I'm this and that, but they are to an extent where, there's a guy here, I think, that's been doing it for 30 years, and all he's ever covered was high school sports, really. And it's like, those guys are so important, and recognizing historical context of things, and seeing the changes over the time frame, and really, getting across, what it means for a community and what it means for that school or that program. I remember covering, it wasn't basketball, but a few years ago, I covered a soccer team who was in their first playoff game ever. It was like their program was like 20 or 25 years old, I think, at the time. And it was their first playoff game ever. They didn't win, but it's like, we were able to really focus in on how that was so important for that school and that community and those teams, and for future teams and that coach, and just bringing everybody together for them to just really kind of have this moment to revel in that and really, take advantage of how historical that was. Like, that kind of stuff is important at the end of the day. And, they may have not won the championship. They came pretty close, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to kind of jog my memory a little bit, but, those are the kind of those moments that you talk about where it's not just about the team or the school, it's about the community and the school and all the students that go there to have some sort of pride and camaraderie and friendship and those kind of things. So I think, there are those different aspects of things that you can, with that really makes it important. And it's like when they talked about, being from Philadelphia, like when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, it's like the whole tri-state area of Philadelphia, or Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, we all come together, and it was like, millions of people at the parade. And it's like, there's people that, family members died without seeing championships and things like that. It's like, you can see that in that perspective. And it's like, but on a lower kind of spectrum of things, it's like, it's really important for certain communities. And, you have communities too, like where, there may be poverty, or there may be, different social issues or something like that. And a lot of times you see those sports, kind of jump up and really take hold. And I haven't necessarily had the chance to cover anything specifically that far into it. So I don't want to speak on that because I personally don't have firsthand experiences like that. But those are instances where you see, like, it's important for community. It's important for helping, maybe, some at-risk kids or things like that. It's important for those on those levels. And I think, guys that have been here for so long, like that guy I mentioned that's been writing in South Jersey decades, he can really pull into that and really, mention when this is specifically important for things like that.
Right. I love it that you, in your job, so often in covering like high school sports, it goes beyond covering the game. You're really, in a lot of cases, telling the stories of the community and telling the stories of the area and the history, and almost like talking about the town and the community as a whole. And so I think that's an awesome point that you mentioned. And so, yeah, that's great. And it kind of puts things into perspective. Like we've talked about, that at the end of the day, it is high school sports, and the stories that we can tell can just go so far beyond that. So,
yeah, definitely.
So to wrap up, I want to have you speak about one of your favorite interactions that you've had with a coach, and then one that you've had with a player. Well, what, in whatever way you define a favorite. I'm just curious, and I'm sure those listening are curious. Like, what has been some of your favorite? What has been a favorite interaction that you've had with a coach and with a player?
Oh man,
so many, I'm sure, which is good that there is a lot to choose from. That's good.
Yeah, I mean,
I gotta really jog my memory on this one. It's not that I don't have ones that stand out. It's just when you have so many great coaches and so many interesting personalities and different personalities that you run into, you get so much out of things.
Or one that like sticks out like in particular, if there's so many to choose from. And that's good that you've had so many great ones.
Yeah. Coach wise, I mean, I've had some colorful ones. I won't mention any names or programs where, we had one coach at like the top level of the championship. She didn't, she went after kind of the referees and the post game thing. And there was a little bit of controversy about it with like the athletic kind of body or whatever in Jersey, but it was interesting because you don't always get those interactions. You get sometimes where like, there should have been a call here and there, but at the end of the day, we need to do better. She kind of just was not like that. And she really just kind of owned in on like certain things. And it was like, it's kind of different to get that perspective and get something that you don't usually get, but I don't want to necessarily focus on just a negative one. There was a positive one. There was a few years ago, and this is probably going to be my favorite player interaction too, just because of the atmosphere around it.
Okay.
A few years ago, I was we have in Jersey called sections. Like you win like your section, and I'm sure you probably have something similar to this out in Arizona. But you win a section, and then you move on to like your like state championship level. But and these girls had to travel like an hour, and I also had to travel like an hour out to it was out in River, which I'm not sure how familiar you are with Jersey. It's not really close to South Jersey. It's more like Central Jersey.
Okay.
And I had to travel out there, and they won on a last-second shot. Their star player got the ball, went down the court, hit a last-second shot. And I remember I shot a video for it. It like went viral from like all the team and the coaches and the players and everybody retweeting it and all this stuff. And it was in my story. And I just remember like how happy they were and just like how ecstatic they were. And then when we finally, we talked to the coach, we talked to a couple other players because the star player who hit the shot was getting mobbed and everybody wanted to talk to her and whatever else. And by the time we finally got her, there was just this huge smile on her face. And the first question wasn't from me, but was from another one of the reporters that were there. He goes, "So you had to know you were getting the ball, right?" And her face, she just starts cracking up. She's like, "Actually, no, I wasn't supposed to." But, we all knew that the ball was supposed to go to her in that instance. She plays it off as, I don't want it in that. It's just, you just get such a, and then the coach is just kind of like trying to play it off like, no, we weren't doing that and all this stuff. And, it's just such a humility about the coaches and the players at this level that sometimes, it's just fun. It's fun to just see how much fun they are having with it and, and just kind of having that humility at the end of the day. And this was a girl who her sisters played on the team. There was not three generations, but 3 like years of them. Like she was a senior at the time. This was one of her last games and her sister was a junior. And then their younger sister was going to be a freshman the next year. So like, it's like, it was just cool to see like her, and just how, she was reacting to that and just kind of those moments. And I think that was just one of my really favorite interactions was after that game, because it was just like, you could just tell like, those moments where she's like, I just don't have any words for it, and sometimes that's even good content to put into a story. Because it's like, you could say like when a kid doesn't have any words to describe something, that's when it's a special moment.
Right. Oh, no, I love it. That's funny too. Yeah, when a kid isn't talking, like, boy, you know that moment had to mean something if they can't even put it into words. That's great.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's awesome. Wow. Like I'm ready. Like I'm ready to coach again. Like I'm ready to see these moments again. Like I can just picture it. And that's phenomenal. That is awesome. All right. So to wrap up, I give every guest what I call my 60-second soapbox to kind of get out their final idea, their final thought, anything you want to reemphasize and give as a closure to this great discussion that we've had. So the floor is yours.
Oh man. I think just at the end of the day, journalism is great. I think people need to really understand that sometimes, there is a lot of similar stuff out there. But I think, when you get beyond the box scores, you get beyond the results of things, really look at what, we try to do as media, and we try to, and that's not even just on the high school level, that's just in general. I think if you look at what they try to do, I think you realize how important it can be, and how, telling a story is necessary, and sharing those aspects of things, because those are things you may not even ever get a chance to hear. And I think at the end of the day, just seeing, how we can tiptoe that fine line of, covering teenagers in a way of making it still meaningful and still impactful, and that local journalism in that level sometimes is more important. So I think just realizing that, and giving, writers the chance. And sometimes you'll have parents that will say, what about my kid? What about this and that? I admit that as myself, we do try to cover as much as we can, especially in areas where we have broad coverage regions. But I think at the end of the day, just, local journalism is so important, especially to high school sports, and especially to what it can do for some of these kids, and getting their names there for colleges and to other coaches, and, in some cases for high school AAU teams and things like that. So I think just remembering that local journalism is so important, and, we really should take time to pick up a newspaper or read those stories, even if it's not about something we necessarily care about as much as, say, our alma mater, or, the pro sports, or whatever it may be.
Love it. Yeah, great thought. Celebrate the stories, read the stories about other schools, and celebrate and be happy for them, and then they will for you, and then just make this a really positive relationship between coaches and journalists, and keep it positive as best we can, and just really celebrate all the cool stories that exist out there. Great. I love it. This was a really insightful discussion. This was a great discussion, and hopefully what it does is just make us as coaches feel a little bit more comfortable talking to those in the media, and understanding that we're all hopefully working together for a common goal. So Daniel Spevak, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to talk about your expertise and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate getting to speak on some of this.
Great, thank you. And hopefully you have some stories to cover soon. Fingers crossed that there's some high school sports for you to be doing pretty soon.
Hopefully. Let's keep those fingers crossed a little bit longer.
Yeah, I think everybody who's involved in sports, professional, collegiate, high school, anywhere who's involved in it has their fingers crossed. So
definitely.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really, really, really appreciate it. Take care. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Make sure to connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, or reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next time.